The wood of the table was mahogany. It was old, scarred by decades of spilled bourbon and forgotten cigars. The wood of the table was mahogany. It was old, scarred by decades of spilled bourbon and forgotten cigars. A dark island in the center of a room that smelled of stale smoke and imminent violence. There were 5 chairs. 4 of them were empty. The 5th was occupied by a man who wasn't moving. He wasn't looking at the door. He wasn't looking at the clock on the wall, which ticked with a rhythm that felt less like time passing and more like a countdown. He was looking at his own hands. They were resting flat on the table, still, perfectly still. Outside, the Harlem rain was turning the streets into black mirrors, but inside, the air was dry as bone. A fly buzzed against the single window pane, a frantic, erratic sound that only emphasized the silence in the rest of the room. The man at the table took a slow breath. He didn't check his weapon. He knew where it was. He knew there was a round in the chamber. He knew the safety was off. But checking it now would be a sign of nerves, and nerves were a luxury he had surrendered 20 years ago. He heard the car before he saw it, the heavy, confident idle of a luxury engine rolling to a stop directly outside the front entrance. Then the slam of a door, heavy, authoritative. Footsteps on the pavement, not the hurried steps of a man running from the rain, but the slow, deliberate stride of a man who believed the rain should stop for him. The doorknob turned. It didn't rattle. It turned slowly, exposing the brass latch. The man at the table didn't look up. He just watched his hands. He waited for the air pressure in the room to change. He waited for the intrusion, because he knew that whoever walked through that door believed they were coming to give orders. They didn't know they were walking into a funeral for their own authority. If you're drawn to the untold power stories of Harlem and the men who ruled without noise, you're already in the right place. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. The door opened. 3 men walked in, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. This meeting does not exist in the official timeline of organized crime. You will not find it in the Valachi papers. You will not find it in the FBI surveillance logs from 1965. It was scrubbed. It was buried, because what happened in this room was embarrassing for men who prided themselves on being untouchable. It was the moment the hierarchy of the underworld fractured. The history books tell you that the 5 families allowed independent operators to exist in Harlem out of benevolence or convenience. That is the lie they tell to keep the myth of their absolute control alive. The truth is much simpler and much darker. They didn't allow it. They were forced to accept it. And the force didn't come from a gun. It came from a mind that understood the geometry of power better than they did. But before the strategy, before the checkmate, you have to understand the cost. Power looks glamorous from the sidewalk. From the inside, it feels like drowning. 3 nights before this meeting, the man at the table hadn't slept. He had paced the floor of his apartment until the carpet wore thin. He had watched his wife sleep, wondering if his ambition was essentially a death warrant for the woman he loved. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes with being the king. You cannot confide in your lieutenants because weakness invites mutiny. You cannot confide in your enemies because they will use it to destroy you. You are trapped in a silo of your own making. He had felt the walls closing in for months. The Italians were getting greedy, the Genovese family specifically. They saw the numbers racket in Harlem not as a partnership, but as a colony. They wanted a higher percentage. They wanted to place their own controllers in the counting houses. They wanted to vet the runners. It started with requests, then it moved to suggestions, then the subtle threats. A window smashed at a cousin's bakery, a shipment of liquor delayed. The message was clear: kneel, or we will break your legs. Most men would have knelt. It makes sense to kneel. You survive. You get to earn. You get to grow old. But for him, kneeling was a physical impossibility. It wasn't about the money. It was about the precedent. If you give a wolf a bite of your hand, he doesn't leave. He waits for the rest of the arm. He knew that simply saying no wasn't enough. Saying no to the mafia is usually the last word a man speaks. He had to say no in a way that made them thank him for it. When he walked into a room, the atmosphere didn't just change, it tightened. People didn't always know who he was, but their instincts did. It was the way he held his head, the way he never seemed to be in a rush. He would walk into the back of a crowded jazz club, and the bartenders would instinctively reach for the top-shelf scotch without being asked. The musicians wouldn't stop playing, but they would play softer, more respectfully. He was a gravity well. He pulled the attention of the room toward him without saying a word. He wore suits that cost more than most men made in a year, but he wore them like armor, not a costume. The three Italians sat down opposite him. They didn't take off their coats. They brought the smell of rain and expensive cologne with them. The man in the middle was a capo, a captain. He had a face like a clenched fist and eyes that had seen too much and felt too little. He placed a heavy leather briefcase on the table. He didn't open it. He just rested his hand on it, marking his territory. "You're hard to reach," the capo said. His voice was raspy, damaged by years of cigars. "I'm right here," the man replied. His voice was different, smooth, deep, like a cello played in a basement. "We sent a messenger Tuesday. I sent him back. He came back with a broken nose." "He tripped," the man said. He didn't smile. He didn't blink. The capo laughed. It was a sharp, sharp sound, devoid of humor. "You have a sense of humor. That's good. You're going to need it. We're here to discuss the new arrangement." "I like the old arrangement." "The old arrangement is dead. Inflation, cost of doing business, the commission decided. The split is 60-40 now, in our favor, and we put our guys in the banks." This was the micro-escalation, the push, the test. The capo was watching the man's eyes, looking for the flicker of fear, the dilation of the pupils that signals submission. He saw nothing. He was looking at a statue. "And if I refuse?" The capo leaned forward. The leather of his coat creaked. "Then you don't have a problem with us. You have a problem with the city. You have a problem with the supply. You have a problem with breathing." The threat hung in the air. It was explicit now. The pretense of partnership was gone. This was an invasion. "I see," the man said. He reached for his pocket. The two men flanking the capo flinched, their hands darting inside their coats. The man stopped, moving slowly, deliberately, pulling out a silver cigarette case. He opened it, selected a cigarette, and tapped it on the mahogany. "You think you own the supply. We own the ports. We own the trucks. We own the cops who watch the trucks. Without us, you're selling air." "That's what you think," the man said. He lit the cigarette. The flame flared, reflecting in the dark eyes of the capo. "But you're making a mistake. You're looking at the map, but you're not looking at the terrain. Don't talk in riddles. It bores me." "It's not a riddle. It's a fact. You think power flows down, from the bosses to the captains to the soldiers to the street. But in Harlem, power flows up. The capo slammed his hand on the table. The noise was like a gunshot. Enough philosophy. You sign the deal or we burn the whole operation down. Tomorrow, we have a crew ready. You have a crew, but you don't have the streets. He took a drag of the cigarette and exhaled a long, thin stream of smoke toward the ceiling. I knew you were coming tonight. I knew what you were going to ask, and I knew you wouldn't listen to reason. So I made a few calls.
Calls to who? The cops? We own the precinct. Not the cops, the man said softly. The unions. The capo paused. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. The unions? The sanitation union. The drivers. The loading dock workers. The people who actually move your product. You see, you pay the bosses. I pay the men. I pay for their kids' braces. I pay for their funerals. I pay for their rent when they get hurt on the job, and you cut them loose. The man leaned forward, his face finally entering the pool of light from the single overhead bulb. As of an hour ago, nothing moves out of the Brooklyn docks if it's marked for your family. Nothing. The cranes are broken. The trucks won't start. The drivers are sick. It's a tragedy. The capo's face went red. You're bluffing. Am I? The man gestured to the phone on the wall in the corner of the room. Call your brother. He's at the warehouse right now, isn't he? Screaming at a foreman who doesn't speak English. The capo stared at the phone. He didn't want to pick it up. He didn't want to confirm it. Because if it was true, the world had just turned upside down. If it was true, the man sitting across from him hadn't just threatened him, he had paralyzed him. Slowly, the capo stood up. He walked to the phone. He dialed a number. He listened. He didn't speak. He just listened to the chaotic noise on the other end of the line, the shouting, the grinding of gears that weren't engaging, the sound of an empire grinding to a halt. He hung up the phone. He turned back to the table. He looked at the man in the chair differently now. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating respect and fear. You can't hold the docks forever, the commission said. The commission will come down on you with everything they have. I don't need to hold them forever, the man replied, snuffing out his cigarette. I just need to hold them until the fruit rots, until the customers go somewhere else, until your other captains start wondering why you're losing them money. He stood up. He wasn't tall, but in that moment he seemed to fill the room. You have a choice. You can go back to your bosses and tell them I'm a problem. Tell them you need a war that will cost you millions in lost shipments, legal fees, and blood. Or... He paused. He let the silence do the work. He let the capo calculate the cost. Or you can tell them that the old arrangement stands, that Harlem is stable, that the money will keep flowing, on time, in full, but only if you stay on your side of the line. The capo looked at his two soldiers. They were confused. They were waiting for a signal to violence, but the signal never came. The math had changed. Violence was no longer the solution. It was the liability. 60-40 is off the table, the capo muttered. Everything is off the table, the man corrected. We stay 50-50, and you take your men out of the counting houses, tonight. The capo gritted his teeth. He picked up his briefcase. It felt heavier now. He looked at the man one last time. You're playing a dangerous game, friend. It's only dangerous if you know the rules, and I wrote the rules. The Italians turned and walked out. The door closed. The
The heavy engine of the Cadillac fired up outside and drove away, fading into the rain. The room was quiet again. The fly was still buzzing against the glass. The man sat back down. He didn't celebrate. He didn't pour a drink. He just looked at his hands again. They were still steady. He had won, but he knew that victory is temporary. In this life, you don't win the war, you just survive the battle. He had bought himself time. He had bought himself respect, but he had also painted a target on his back that would never wash off. The next day, the trucks in Brooklyn started moving again. The money flowed. The Italians stayed downtown, but the story of the meeting spread. It was whispered in the barber shops on 125th Street. It was murmured in the pool halls. The story of the night the mob blinked. It changed the way people walked in Harlem. They walked with their heads a little higher. They realized that the monster wasn't invincible. It could be stopped, not with a gun, but with a mind. The man went back to his routine. He played chess in the park. He ate at the diner. He walked the streets. But he was different now. He had transcended the role of a gangster. He had become a gatekeeper, a sovereign. He had proven that power isn't about the title you hold, it's about the leverage you control. Years later, when the old neighborhood was changing, when the heroin epidemic was tearing the streets apart and the old codes were dying, people would still talk about that night. They would talk about the silence in the room. They would talk about the phone call. They would talk about the man who sat in a chair and stopped an army with a cigarette and a few well-placed favors. It was a lesson in the nature of control. Real power isn't loud. It doesn't scream. It doesn't need to brandish a weapon. Real power is the ability to sit in a quiet room, wait for the enemy to walk in, and calmly explain to them why they have already lost. It is the ability to make the world stop just for a moment and wait for your permission to spin again. The rain eventually stopped that night. The sun came up over the rooftops of Harlem. The city woke up, noisy and chaotic as always. But on that corner, in that room, the ghost of that meeting remained, a testament to the night the map was redrawn.